She found the hidden journal in the barn, pages cracked with age, ink bleeding stories of forbidden love, blood spilled on the land, and a vow carved in whispers. Tell our story true with reverence. But when Sadie caught Wyatt's voice low behind the barn, trading secrets with the men who'd carved Raven Ridge into profit, something inside her splintered. You promised we'd protect this place, she hissed, fists clenched around the embroidered cloth. Wyatt met her eyes, guilty, silent. Some ghosts don't haunt you. They test you. Would you walk away from love that cost everything? Or stand and fight for a vow no grave could bury? Sadie Quinn didn't grow up knowing the word heritage. She just knew the cold of Wyoming winters, the snap of ice when it broke beneath her boots, and the ache that settled in her bones after hours of shoveling manure from stalls older than her mother's grave. At 24, she had calluses instead of jewelry, scars instead of silk. The other girls in town whispered about husbands, church socials, and lace curtains. Sadie whispered to herself just to keep warm. She'd taken the job at Raven Ridge Ranch not because it was easy, but because it was the only place left that didn't ask too many questions. The ranch had once been alive with cattle drives, horses with Spanish bloodlines, and the distant echo of children laughing under the cottonwoods. But that was before fences broke, before storms caved in roofs, before the last Holloway air vanished like smoke. Or so people thought. Sadie first saw Wyatt Holloway at dawn, leaning against the paddock fence, dressed like a drifter with a battered hat and a coat with the seams picked loose by wind. He didn't look like an heir. He looked like a man who'd run out of places to hide. She didn't know then that his boots cost more than her year's wages, that the revolver under his coat had once belonged to Callum Ashford, the name she'd come to whisper like a ghost blessing. Back then, all she knew was that when she bent to shovel out the frozen straw, he stepped forward, picked up a second shovel, and worked beside her like he'd done it all his life. He didn't say much. Neither did she. That was the thing about people who carry stories in silence. They recognize each other without speaking. It was near midnight the first time Sadie found the hidden journal. She'd been looking for a half-full sack of oats the barn manager swore was there. Her lantern flickered on the crooked beams, the smell of old hay and horse sweat thick enough to choke her lungs. She tripped on a loose plank, her boot wedged tight. When she tugged it free, the board lifted like a mouth opening to secrets. Underneath, wrapped in oilcloth darkened by time, was the leather-bound book. Sadie sat cross-legged on the cold ground, lantern balanced on a rusty milk pail. Her breath clouded the pages as she traced the name on the first line. Callum Ashford, October 3rd, 1864. She read until the wick burned low, the words drawing her deeper into a love story that didn't fit the world it had been born into. Callum, son of a cattle baron, and Naomi Redbird, daughter of the hills and wind. They'd carved their vows into cedar bark, whispered them beneath a blood moon, and fled when the world came with torches and lies. Sadie touched the last page with the care of a daughter finding a family she never knew she needed. She didn't tell Wyatt about the journal, not at first, but he watched her change. He'd see her sitting by the hearth in the abandoned bunkhouse, lips moving over old words, eyes lit with something he hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. When he finally asked, she showed him the pages. Together they read Callum's final entries, Naomi's embroidered cloth tucked safe between them like a fragile heartbeat. Do you think they found their peace? Sadie asked once, voice raw after a day when the wind had rattled every window of the ranch house like the dead wanting in. Wyatt didn't answer. He just reached for her gloved hand and squeezed it tight enough that she felt the warmth through the wool. In that barn, surrounded by the smell of hay and old iron, they were two people trying to remember something bigger than themselves. But the world has a way of testing people who think they can guard ghosts. It was a week later when Sadie woke before dawn and saw the lamp still burning in the far barn. She followed the flicker through snowdrifts and wind that cut through her coat like knives. There, through the warped boards, she saw Wyatt, not the man who'd shoveled manure beside her or read Callum's words by firelight, but the heir, the Holloway. You know what this land's worth, son, a stranger's voice said, slick as oil. Let us build here. Let the past rot. You'll live easy, far from this frozen graveyard. Sadie pressed her palm to her mouth to keep the sob from escaping. In her pocket, The embroidered cloth itched against her skin. Naomi's last vow. You swore, she hissed under her breath. You swore we'd protect this place. Some ghosts don't haunt you. They test you. And tonight, Raven Ridge was testing them both. Sadie Quinn learned to keep secrets long before she learned to trust people with them. She came from a line of folks who knew how to lose things. Fathers swallowed by the mines, mothers who coughed up blood each winter, brothers who vanished into the promise of railroad pay that never quite reached home. She'd seen what happened when you depended too much on the mercy of others. It made you soft, and soft didn't last long out here. She'd arrived at Raven Ridge Ranch half frozen, trailing a half-dead mule and carrying 2 blankets, 1 cracked kettle, and a tin box of dried beans. She was 24, but looked older when the wind caught her eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. She asked no questions when the foreman told her the only job left was mucking out the barns. She only nodded, rolled up her sleeves, and went to work before dawn. The other hands, men twice her size, whispered behind her back, "That Quinn girl, she'll break before spring." But she didn't break. She didn't even bend. When the Wyoming winds scraped the flesh off your bones and turned spit to ice before it hit the ground, Sadie learned to smile with cracked lips and frozen fingers. Some nights she'd sleep beside the oldest mare just for the heat, her breath tangled in the horse's mane, dreaming not of riches, but of warmth that didn't come at the cost of her pride. She could have left Raven Ridge when she realized the ranch was barely alive. Fences leaning like drunk old men, barns half rotted through, the main house shuttered and creaking in the wind. But Sadie stayed. Maybe she saw something in that broken place that matched the cracks inside her. Maybe she believed, in a way she couldn't yet name, that some land was worth more than the coin it could bring. She'd heard the town gossip, of course, how the Holloway name once meant something. Cattle barons, land grants, miles of grazing stretching to the horizon, and how it all fell apart when Callum Ashford, Wyatt's great-grandfather, took up with Naomi Redbird, a woman who carried the hills in her hair and the tribe's stories on her tongue. Folks in town called it a scandal. Sadie read it in that journal and called it a promise, because what Callum and Naomi left behind wasn't just soil or timber. It was something wilder, something alive. Sadie felt it the first time she laid her hand against the barn wall, feeling the wind rattle through the planks. She liked to think it was Naomi's breath, still wandering these ridges when the world forgot her name. But it wasn't ghosts that paid for medicine or bread. That was the thing about hope. It didn't fill a hungry belly or warm a dying mother's bed. So Sadie did what her people always did. She worked harder than her body allowed. Some nights she'd fall asleep on the stall floor, straw in her hair, dreaming of the day she could send enough coin to the old shack where her mother lay wrapped in blankets, too thin for the wind that came off the mesa. Then came Wyatt Holloway. At first she thought him just another drifter, boots scuffed from wandering, eyes too kind for a man used to taking. He never flaunted the Holloway name, never spoke of deeds or inheritance. He just picked up a shovel beside her, shoulder to shoulder, wordless. That was enough for Sadie, who never trusted pretty words anyway. But even as she grew to trust the weight of his silence, the truth sat between them like a knife half buried in wood. Sadie knew what happened when men with land and bloodlines looked at a woman like her. A barn girl with no kin to claim her name, no coin to buy a seat at any table that mattered. She knew what betrayal tasted like before it ever touched her lips. Some nights when Wyatt sat with her by the fire, their knees almost touching, she'd steal glances at his hands. Not the rough, nicked knuckles of a ranch hand born poor, but the long fingers of a man raised to hold a pen or sign a deed. She wondered what he'd written before he learned how to wield a shovel, and if the ink of his promises would dry out when men with silver tongues came knocking. But even with her heart braced for the break, Sadie let him in, piece by piece, secret by secret. She let him see the letter she carried, written by her mother's trembling hand, asking forgiveness for debts unpaid and sins unnamed. She let him help her read Callum's journal by the lantern light. She let him hold her hand when the fire burned low. In Wyatt's quiet, Sadie found a story she wanted to believe, that maybe this land, and what was buried beneath it, could save them both. That maybe Raven Ridge was not just another graveyard for hope, but a place where the right promise kept true could turn cold earth warm again. The first time Sadie turned the pages of Callum Ashford's journal, the barn seemed to breathe with her. Lantern light flickered on the cracked leather binding. The ink bled through thin yellowed paper like veins under skin. She ran her finger along the first line, each letter an echo from a century ago. October 3rd, 1864. Her name is Naomi Redbird. She stands where the hills break open. She is the wind that knows my name. Sadie read those lines over and over until the words lodged themselves in her ribs. To her, they weren't just words. They were proof that someone once chose love over land, truth over profit. They were proof that the wind didn't just steal stories. Sometimes it carried them forward for someone stubborn enough to listen. Callum Ashford was the eldest son of Thomas Ashford, a man who built Raven Ridge with cattle, silver, and the bones of anyone who stood in his way. The Ashfords were known for their black ledgers and even blacker tempers. Callum was supposed to marry the banker's daughter and double the family fortune. But Callum's ink bled into a different promise the day he saw Naomi Redbird. In his entries, he called her the breath between storms. He wrote of her laughter as something that cracked him open like spring thunder, splitting dry ground. Sadie pressed the page closer to the flame, eyes tracing Callum's shaky lines where he described the secret carvings he left for Naomi. A hawk feather tucked behind the trading post, a bead carved with her tribe's symbols, hidden beneath a flat stone by the river. I am heir to more land than I can ride in a month, he wrote in one entry, and yet none of it is mine if I cannot stand beside her without shame. Sadie closed the book for a moment, her thumb tapping the cover. She whispered into the barn's silence, "So much land, but no freedom to love." Wyatt sat beside her that night, his elbows resting on his knees. He hadn't spoken for a long while, just watching the way the shadows danced across Sadie's face. When she looked up, he said softly, "Do you think they ever really escaped?" Sadie traced a finger over the edge of the cloth Naomi embroidered, the one that had been folded between the pages like a heartbeat pressed flat. "They didn't run," she said. "They claimed." There's a difference. Callum's words grew more frantic as the pages turned. One entry spoke of Naomi's people, the Redbird line, keepers of stories older than the ranch itself. He wrote how Naomi taught him to listen, not just to her voice, but to the land's. She showed him where the deer slipped through the cottonwoods and where the ridge stones crumbled into fossils and secrets. Wyatt read that line aloud, voice low. She showed him where the dead rest easy when the living remember them. Sadie closed her eyes. And what happens when the living forget? Neither had an answer. It was a week into their ritual when they came to the blood-stained page. Callum's script was ragged, blotted with something dark that smelled faintly of iron, even all these decades later. They came at dawn. I do not know if they were soldiers or thieves. They called her savage whore. I begged them to let her run. I would have given every acre to see her safe, but the bullet found her heart before my bargain could find my tongue. The barn's shadows seemed to swallow the words. Sadie's throat tightened as she read them again and again. In that moment, she didn't see Callum and Naomi. She saw herself and Wyatt, backs pressed to rough boards, the world just outside, waiting to tear them apart in its own quiet way. One night after the cattle were fed and the lanterns burned low, Sadie pulled Wyatt outside. They stood by the old fence line where the ridge dropped off into the dark. She held the journal tight against her chest. "What do you see when you look out there?" she asked him. Wyatt squinted at the hills, their edges blurred by a hush of snow. "Land, work, maybe a way out." Sadie shook her head. "I see them, still here, still waiting for someone to remember they mattered more than money ever could." Sometimes Sadie wondered what Naomi would think if she could stand beside her now. Boots sunk in mud, hair caught in the Wyoming wind, hands raw but unshaken. Would she tell her to keep reading, to keep shoveling the filth, to keep the promise no bullet could bury? When Wyatt asked her why the journal mattered so much, Sadie said, "Because it means no one can pave over what was true. It means we don't have to lie to ourselves about what this place cost." And that was the hardest truth of all, that love like theirs had a price, and the payment never ended. What they didn't know yet, what Sadie hadn't told Wyatt, was that she'd started to carve her own lines on the back pages. Small promises scribbled in the dark. I will stand my ground. I will tell our story true. I will love without hiding. Maybe one day, someone would find her words too, pressed between pages like a wildflower dried flat by time, but never fully dead. Sadie stood in the open doorway of the old barn, her breath making ghosts in the freezing air. Naomi's embroidered cloth was clenched in her fist so tight the threads cut into her palm. Outside, she could still hear the echo of voices, Wyatt's voice among them, low and careful, bartering away the same land he'd once vowed to protect. She'd heard every word, the slick stranger's offer, the promise of new fences, new roads, new money, all for a piece of ground that had already been paid for in blood. When Wyatt stepped into the barn, snow caught in his hair, he froze. The look in Sadie's eyes stopped him colder than any winter wind. You promised, she said. Her voice was steady, but her shoulders trembled with something more dangerous than cold. You promised we'd remember, that we'd stand where Callum and Naomi couldn't. Wyatt's jaw tightened. He dropped his eyes to the floorboards, to the same cracked plank where they'd first found the journal. He wanted to tell her it was just talk, that he needed to hear what the men offered, that he hadn't signed anything. But the words felt like a lie before they left his tongue. Say it, Sadie spat. Say you'd trade their story for a clean ledger and a warm bed somewhere far from here. Wyatt looked at her then, really looked. In her eyes, he saw Naomi Redbird's defiance, Callum Ashford's foolish courage. He saw the same wind that had carved Raven Ridge into the bones of the frontier, and he saw what he'd almost buried. I never meant to, he said. It was all he could manage. Sadie stepped forward, pressing the cloth into his chest so hard he had to catch it before it fell. Meanings don't matter out here, Wyatt. Only choices. Then she turned, her boots crunching over straw and dirt, her breath a ragged storm. She left him standing there, the barn suddenly too small for all his father's promises and grandfather's sins. For 3 days, Sadie didn't come back. Wyatt searched every paddock, every half-collapsed shed. Her cot in the tack room was stripped bare. The gloves he'd given her that first winter lay folded on the bunk, clean, lined up like an accusation. The ranch hands said they'd seen her heading east, toward the ridge trail that split off into Shoshone land. Wyatt knew what that meant. He saddled his horse at dawn on the 4th day and rode west, the same direction Callum Ashford had once fled, heart cracked open and hands empty. Each mile was a confession. Each gust of wind seemed to whisper Naomi's name. He stopped at the old trading post, now just a leaning shack with half the roof caved in. An elder woman with braids like black river stones told him of the hollow in the cliffs where Naomi had gone to mourn Callum. You seek the grave of the promise, she said, touching his face as if searching for the Ashford blood that never quite washed out. Wyatt found the place near dusk. A stack of stones half buried in snow, each one marked with tiny carvings he could not read but somehow felt under his skin. He knelt there, cold seeping through his coat, his breath heavy on the stones. He set Naomi's cloth on top, smoothing the edges with fingers that still smelled of horse and smoke. I don't know if you can hear me, he whispered, but I remember. I swear to God, I will not bury you again. He didn't pray for forgiveness. He didn't deserve it. But he stayed there through the night, the stars crowding the winter sky, until dawn cracked the ridge and turned the snow to glass. When Wyatt returned to Raven Ridge, the men with their deeds and ledgers were waiting by the gate. He didn't even dismount. Get off my land, he told them, voice steady as frost, and take your ghosts with you. They threatened him, of course. Lawyers, courts, debts unpaid. Wyatt only nodded toward the ridge where the snow still covered Callum and Naomi's resting place. Try it. See what this land remembers when you put a shovel in it. The men left. The ranch stayed. Sadie found him 2 days later, mending the broken fence by the old barn. She didn't say a word at first, just stood there, arms crossed, the Wyoming wind tugging at her hair like it wanted to take her, too. Wyatt straightened. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. I didn't sell it. Sadie looked past him to the barn door, now reinforced with fresh boards. The journal sat inside on the old table, its pages spread open to Callum's last vow. Legacy doesn't live in paper, she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. It lives in what you choose to stand for when no one's watching. Wyatt nodded. He pulled something from his pocket, the gloves she'd left behind. He held them out like a peace offering. If you'll stay, we'll guard it together. The land, the story, all of it. Sadie took the gloves. They fit her just as they always had. Rough at the seams, patched but strong, like them. They stood together in the doorway then. Raven Ridge spread out before them, battered but unbroken. Sadie thought, stories like theirs keep breathing, carved into the land and carried in hands stubborn enough to fight for them. And this time, they would. When dawn came to Raven Ridge, Sadie Quinn stood alone at the fence line, hands resting on the rough wood Wyatt Holloway had repaired the week before. The wind rolled over the hills the way Naomi Redbird once described in Callum Ashford's journal, like a breath that never quite leaves you. Sometimes Sadie wondered if this land would ever really be theirs, not in deeds and ledgers, but in truth. Because truth, she learned, doesn't live on paper. It lives in the choices you make when no one's watching. She'd heard folks in town say she was foolish, that she and Wyatt could have sold this place, moved south, found softer winters and fields that didn't eat fence posts like dry bones. But she thought about people like old Mabel Collins, who patched her roof with her husband's initials carved into the beam above her bed. So when she died, the first thing she'd see would be proof he'd once swung a hammer for her. Or Tobias Blackwell, the fence rider who wouldn't leave when the banks came. He rode that line year after year until they found him one winter with a broken saddle and a hammer still tied to his wrist. Some lines are worth holding, he'd written on the back of a receipt in his coat pocket. Sadie would close her eyes at night and picture them all. Mabel, Tobias, even Naomi Redbird, stitching blue thread through the edge of a cloth that now lay sealed in a glass case. The cloth said it all. Never parted, not by death, nor wind, nor flame. And wasn't that the real inheritance? Not the cattle or the acres, but the knowing that someone once stood here, spine straight against the wind, saying no, not for sale, not forgotten. Sometimes Wyatt would ask her if she ever regretted staying, if she wished she'd left that barn floor the night she found Callum's words hidden under rotten boards. She'd smile at him, tired but steady, and say, "We're not saints, Wyatt. We're just the ones who stayed when it would have been easier to run." Maybe that was all Raven Ridge ever needed. Two people too stubborn to let memory die. Two people willing to carry a story that couldn't be paved over, no matter what silver-tongued men promised at the fence line. Now standing there, Sadie could almost feel the shape of Callum and Naomi's footprints beneath the snow, never fully erased. She felt Wyatt's shoulder brush hers, warm and real, his breath in the dawn chill. She thought of all the ghosts here, not to haunt, but to keep the living honest. She looked out across the ridge, where dawn light brushed the fence she'd sworn to guard. If one day someone else found her words here, maybe they'd stand a little straighter too, and that would be enough. In the end, Sadie Quinn and Wyatt Holloway didn't just save a broken ranch. They guarded something that still speaks to any of us who've ever held a story that no one else believed was worth saving. Maybe that's the real lesson buried in the snow at Raven Ridge, that some fences are worth mending even when no one's watching, that sometimes the loudest promise is the one whispered in a journal or stitched into a piece of cloth, the kind you carry forward so the wind doesn't scatter it for good. In our modern world, it's easy to forget what we stand for when every voice says sell, pave, move on. But Callum and Naomi's vow, and the choice Sadie and Wyatt made, remind us. Legacy isn't what you own. It's what you refuse to forget. So tonight I ask you, what stories would you fight to keep alive? What small piece of your family's land, name, or memory is worth holding when everyone else says it isn't? Drop a comment below and share what your Raven Ridge is. Maybe it's an old family farm. Maybe it's a song your mother sang. Maybe it's a story only you remember. Thank you for riding this journey with us tonight. If this tale touched your heart, if it made you think of your own roots, your own hidden journals, please hit like, subscribe, and pass it on to someone who still believes some stories should never be buried. Because sometimes the bravest thing we can do is to remember, together.